What if disclosure does not begin with information being released, but with structures failing to hold their shape? Most expect disclosure to arrive as revelation, documents, confirmations, statements. But what unfolds in endgame phases is different. Truth does not arrive fully formed. It emerges through stress. When a system is stable, it can absorb contradiction quietly. When it becomes unstable, contradiction turns visible. From our perspective, disclosure has never been about secrets becoming known. It has always been about mechanisms becoming observable. You are witnessing a phase where systems reveal how they operate when their legitimacy weakens, how they respond when belief erodes, how they behave when consent is no longer automatic. This is not chaos. It is diagnostic. Every complex structure carries within it a threshold. Beyond that threshold, adaptation becomes impossible and control replaces coherence. This is how endgames begin, not with collapse, but with overcorrection, with rigidity instead of flexibility, with force instead of alignment. When authority must be enforced repeatedly, it signals that authority has already failed internally. From an Arcturian perspective, these moments are not random. They appear when accumulated contradictions reach critical density. Economic strain, generational divergence, informational saturation, all converge. At that point, the system no longer governs reality. It reacts to it, and reaction exposes design. This is why disclosure feels unsettling. Not because something new is happening, but because something hidden has stopped working invisibly. People often ask when disclosure begins. It begins when explanations lose power, when narratives require enforcement, when the gap between what is said and what is lived becomes impossible to ignore. In this phase, truth does not need to be announced. It becomes self-evident. You can observe this by watching where energy concentrates, where control intensifies, where speech narrows instead of opening. These are not signs of strength. They are markers of systems reaching their limit of self-correction. From our view, endgames are not moral judgments. They are structural transitions. They do not ask you to choose sides. They ask you to see clearly. Seeing clearly does not mean absorbing emotion or outrage. It means recognizing patterns without becoming entangled in them. This distinction matters, because when perception becomes fused with reaction, clarity collapses. And clarity is essential in endgame phases, not to predict outcomes, but to remain oriented while exposure accelerates. The question is not whether disclosure is happening. The question is whether you are reading it as information or recognizing it as architecture under stress. Once this distinction is made, the noise begins to reorganize into signal. And from there, understanding deepens, not through belief, but through observation. That is the ground from which everything else in this transmission unfolds. Disclosure accelerates when systems lose the ability to correct themselves quietly. At earlier stages, pressure is redistributed internally. Adjustments are made out of public view. Narratives are refined. Authority is preserved through subtle recalibration. But when contradictions accumulate faster than they can be absorbed, containment fails. At that point, exposure begins. From an Arcturian perspective, this is not about intention. It is about capacity. Every system has a finite capacity to manage inconsistency between what it claims and what it enforces. When that capacity is exceeded, response shifts from governance to control. Control is not strength. It is a signal of structural saturation. You can recognize this phase by its patterns. Language narrows. Dissent is reframed as threat. Complexity is replaced with certainty. The system becomes louder, not clearer. This is how endgames announce themselves. not through confession, but through compression. As pressure rises, choices disappear. Systems stop adapting and begin reacting. Reaction exposes priorities. It shows what must be protected at all costs and what can be sacrificed. This is where disclosure moves from information to visibility. The most important revelations at this stage are not documents or admissions. They are behavioral. They reveal how authority functions when belief erodes, how fear is deployed when consent weakens, how legitimacy is substituted with force. You are observing this pattern now in multiple regions, expressed in different languages, cultures, and conditions. The specifics vary. The architecture does not. When public response widens across social layers and reaction intensifies instead of stabilizes, it indicates that the system is no longer negotiating reality. It is attempting to override it. Override is always temporary. From our view, this phase marks the transition from managed secrecy to unavoidable exposure. Not because someone chooses transparency, but because opacity becomes unsustainable. This is why disclosure feels fragmented rather than cohesive. It does not arrive as a unified truth. It arrives as contradiction made visible. You may notice that explanations lose coherence. Official narratives multiply rather than consolidate. Authority appears everywhere at once, and therefore nowhere. This is not confusion. It is decentralization of meaning. When centralized narratives fail, interpretation shifts outward. Individuals are forced to read patterns directly without mediation. This creates instability for those accustomed to externally supplied certainty. But it also creates clarity. Clarity does not come from knowing outcomes. It comes from recognizing structure. At this stage, the most useful question is not what will happen next. It is what is being revealed about how power operates. When you observe response rather than rhetoric, exposure becomes readable. When you track enforcement rather than explanation, design becomes visible. This is the function of endgames. They remove ambiguity by eliminating subtlety. What remains is not truth as ideology, but truth as operation. And once operation is visible, authority changes permanently, regardless of how events resolve on the surface. This is why endgames do not reverse. They do not depend on outcomes. They depend on perception crossing a threshold. Once crossed, the system is no longer believed in the same way. From that point forward, disclosure is no longer a question of if, only of how stability will be reestablished after exposure. That is the terrain now forming beneath the noise. Not collapse, not revelation, but architecture revealing itself under pressure. What is unfolding in Iran should not be read as an isolated event. From an Arcturian perspective, it functions as a pressure node, a point where multiple systemic contradictions converge and become externally visible at the same time. Economic strain alone does not produce this level of instability. Generational tension alone does not either. Political dissatisfaction by itself is insufficient. What creates exposure is convergence. When economic pressure, generational fracture, narrative exhaustion, and loss of institutional trust align, a system enters a phase where internal correction is no longer possible. At that point, response replaces governance. This distinction is essential. Governance adapts. Response reacts. What you are witnessing is not primarily about protest. It is about how the system answers pressure. At pressure nodes like this, risk does not come from intention. It comes from miscalculation under compression. When systems operate under sustained stress, decision-making windows narrow. Signals are misread. Reaction time accelerates. This is how high-impact incidents become possible, not through strategy, but through structural overload. From our perspective, nuclear risk during endgame phases is not an objective. It is a byproduct of instability when containment mechanisms are pushed beyond tolerance. This is why the focus must remain structural, not sensational. When dissent appears across multiple layers of society, a stable system differentiates. It absorbs, negotiates, redistributes. An unstable system compresses. It simplifies. It enforces. Enforcement is not a display of control. It is evidence of architectural limitation. At this stage, legitimacy no longer regulates behavior. Force becomes the substitute. And the moment force becomes routine, the system discloses its internal dependency. This disclosure is irreversible, not because the system collapses, but because its operating logic becomes visible. Once dependency on fear and enforcement is observed, authority changes permanently in perception. It may still act, it may still command, but it no longer feels implicit. You will notice that explanation loses relevance. Justifications repeat without persuading. Language hardens while meaning thins. This is not a communication problem. It is structural exhaustion. From an Arcturian standpoint, the global relevance of Iran at this moment lies in its visibility. Dynamics that remain partially obscured elsewhere are fully exposed here, not because the system is unique, but because it reached saturation earlier. This is how disclosure advances, not evenly, not simultaneously, but through nodes where pressure exceeds tolerance and response reveals limitation. These nodes function as mirrors. They reflect patterns present across many systems, even where they are not yet fully expressed. This is why framing the situation as merely regional misses its function. The event itself is not the message. The response pattern is. When systems under compression narrow perception, accelerate reaction, and rely on force, they enter conditions where error becomes more likely. And this is precisely why stabilization, not escalation, becomes the critical factor in endgame phases. From here onward, attention naturally shifts away from what the system claims and toward how it behaves under stress. Behavior, once observed consistently, rewrites perception. And once perception shifts, the endgame is already in motion. Not as chaos, not as catastrophe, but as architecture revealing its limits in real time. And once limits are visible, they cannot be unseen. Endgames do not begin when people rebel. They begin when systems can no longer self-correct quietly. At this stage, every response becomes visible because nothing can be absorbed internally anymore. Adjustments that once happened behind closed doors are now performed in the open under pressure. This is why exposure accelerates. A system in endgame does not reveal truth intentionally. It reveals itself functionally. You can see this in the way authority is exercised. Decisions become faster, narrower, and less nuanced. Ambiguity is treated as danger. Complexity is reframed as disobedience. These are not strategic choices. They are structural symptoms. When legitimacy weakens, force becomes the substitute. When force becomes routine, exposure becomes unavoidable. From an Arcturian perspective, this phase marks a clear boundary. On one side, authority relied on internal agreement. On the other, authority depends on enforcement. Once that boundary is crossed, perception changes permanently. People no longer ask whether a system is right. They begin to ask how it operates when challenged. This shift is critical because systems do not collapse when they are opposed. They collapse when they are understood. Understanding removes mystique. It dissolves the emotional gravity that holds structures together. When fear loses coherence, control loses efficiency. This is why disclosure endgames are not dramatic revelations. They are prolonged processes of demystification. The system continues to act, but it no longer defines reality in the same way. What you are seeing is not instability spreading outward. It is clarity spreading inward, and clarity is irreversible. Now anchor this perspective. Write in the comments. Disclosure happens when systems expose how they function. Write it exactly as it is. Do not add explanation. This is not affirmation. It is orientation. It stabilizes perception by separating observation from reaction. From this orientation, events no longer feel random or overwhelming. They begin to resolve into patterns, and patterns are readable. Readable systems lose absolute authority. This is why endgames feel unsettling at first, then strangely quiet. Once exposure is recognized, the need to emotionally engage diminishes. What remains is not certainty, but context. And context restores stability where fear once dominated. From here, disclosure continues not as revelation, but as increasing visibility of structure. The system does not end suddenly. It ends by being seen clearly. And once seen clearly, it can no longer operate invisibly. That is the threshold now crossed. After exposure becomes visible, the system does not collapse immediately. It enters a phase of energy strain. What once functioned with minimal effort now requires constant reinforcement. Authority must be reapplied. Narratives must be repeated. Enforcement becomes routine rather than exceptional. This is not escalation by choice. It is escalation by design limitation. From an Arcturian perspective, this phase reveals inefficiency. Not because resources are gone, but because the architecture no longer matches reality. When design and reality diverge, friction increases. Friction consumes energy. As energy is redirected toward maintaining control, less remains for adaptation. Decision-making narrows. Feedback is filtered out. Correction becomes impossible. This is why endgame phases feel repetitive. The same statements recur. The same actions intensify. The same justifications circulate without effect. This repetition is not strategy. It is structural fatigue. At this point, exposure no longer depends on events. It advances through visibility of limits. Each response shows what the system can no longer do quietly. From here, the key shift is perceptual. Those who track outcomes experience urgency. Those who track structure experience orientation. Orientation matters because it prevents emotional fusion with instability. When perception remains structural, exposure informs rather than overwhelms. From our view, this is the moment when authority begins to redistribute. Not suddenly and not evenly, but irreversibly. Influence moves away from centralized narratives and toward localized interpretation. Meaning becomes conditional. Compliance becomes selective. This does not require resistance. It occurs naturally when belief withdraws. As belief withdraws, force becomes less efficient. Not immediately ineffective, but increasingly costly. Over time, cost exceeds capacity. That threshold is not dramatic. It is mathematical. Systems cannot sustain indefinite reinforcement without adaptation. When adaptation is unavailable, exposure accelerates by default. This is why endgames do not feel explosive. They feel draining. And drainage reveals limits faster than confrontation ever could. Once this is recognized, exposure no longer feels chaotic. It becomes readable. Each response adds information about structure, capacity, and constraint. That information accumulates, and accumulation changes perception permanently. From this point forward, the question is no longer whether the system will hold. It is how much energy it must spend to appear as if it still does. That difference defines the endgame phase now underway. At this stage, it is important to understand how containment actually functions during endgame phases. Risk does not escalate because systems intend harm. It escalates when compression narrows perception and decision cycles shorten. When structures operate under sustained pressure, thresholds are crossed unintentionally. Signals are misread. Timing collapses. Errors become more likely, not because of malice, but because capacity is exceeded. From an Arcturian perspective, this is where our function becomes relevant. Our role is not political intervention and not control of outcomes. It is stabilization of escalation thresholds. When systems approach points where irreversible damage could occur through misalignment or miscalculation, containment fields are reinforced. This does not stop systems from acting. It disrupts the chain of escalation before actions lock into irreversible sequences. Nuclear incidents, in particular, are not prevented through force or confrontation. They are prevented by interrupting feedback loops that compress decision-making into binary outcomes. This work is precise. It does not announce itself. It does not alter narratives. It leaves no visible trace. It appears only as what does not happen. From your perspective, this can look like delay, hesitation, or sudden de-escalation without explanation. From ours, it is the restoration of temporal bandwidth, enough time for pressure to redistribute and thresholds to stabilize. This does not mean risk disappears. It means catastrophic convergence is avoided. Endgame phases always carry elevated risk because exposure increases stress across systems simultaneously. Containment does not remove this stress. It ensures that stress does not collapse into singular, irreversible events. This distinction matters. Without containment, instability would cascade. With containment, instability remains distributed. Distributed instability is survivable. Convergent instability is not. Our work focuses on maintaining distribution. By widening perception windows, slowing reaction chains, and reducing compression at critical nodes, escalation loses momentum. Outcomes remain open rather than locked. This is why fear-based predictions consistently fail. They assume linear escalation. They ignore active stabilization. The absence of catastrophe is not evidence that nothing is happening. It is evidence that containment is operational. From this vantage point, disclosure continues without collapse. Exposure advances without irreversible damage. Structures reveal limits without triggering terminal outcomes. This is the balance required during endgames. Not control, not prevention, but continuous stabilization at the edges of error. And as long as stabilization holds, exposure can proceed without crossing thresholds that would end coherence entirely. That is the function being fulfilled now, quietly, continuously, and without demand for recognition. As exposure continues, a quieter shift takes place beneath the visible events. Attention begins to decouple from authority. For a long time, perception was organized by centralized signals. Official statements, institutional narratives, and inherited frameworks provided orientation. Even when trust weakened, these structures still functioned as reference points. During endgame phases, that function erodes, not because alternatives are immediately trusted, but because centralized authority no longer stabilizes meaning. From an Arcturian perspective, this is a critical transition. When attention detaches from authority, it does not disappear. It redistributes. Individuals begin to rely more on direct observation, pattern recognition, and local coherence. This does not produce instant clarity. It produces uncertainty without deference. That distinction matters. Uncertainty with deference keeps systems intact. Uncertainty without deference allows recalibration. As this recalibration unfolds, you may notice a change in how information is received. Messages that once carried emotional weight lose impact. Repetition no longer persuades. Urgency no longer compels the same response. This is not apathy. It is desensitization to control signals. Control relies on predictability. When reactions become less predictable, control loses efficiency. Not because people rebel, but because they stop responding in expected ways. From our view, this is one of the most significant markers of endgame phases. The system continues to speak, but fewer people internalize its tone. This creates a strange quiet beneath the noise. Externally, activity intensifies. Internally, attention withdraws. This withdrawal is not disengagement from reality. It is disengagement from compelled interpretation. People begin to wait before reacting, to observe longer, to question less emotionally. This delay weakens feedback loops that once sustained authority. Without immediate emotional response, enforcement becomes less effective. At this stage, exposure no longer needs events to progress. It advances through attenuation, the gradual loss of influence. What once shaped behavior now requires constant reinforcement. What once guided perception now competes for attention. Competition is not dominance. It is erosion. From an Arcturian standpoint, this phase is where endgames become irreversible. Not because structures collapse, but because attention no longer returns to its previous alignment. Once attention learns to orient without centralized authority, it does not easily relearn dependency. This does not produce instant freedom. It produces structural independence. Independence is quieter than rebellion, but far more enduring. As attention continues to redistribute, systems face a choice they cannot avoid. Adapt to reduced influence or expend increasing energy attempting to reclaim it. Most choose the latter. That choice accelerates exposure, not because it provokes resistance, but because it confirms limitation. And limitation, once observed, reshapes expectation. This is how endgames advance without spectacle, through attention quietly relocating away from structures that can no longer hold it. And once attention moves, authority follows, whether the system acknowledges it or not. As attention redistributes, a new responsibility quietly appears. Not responsibility to act, responsibility to remain coherent. When centralized structures lose influence, the field becomes more sensitive to individual states. Emotional volatility propagates faster. Calm stabilizes faster. Reaction amplifies noise. Clarity contains it. From an Arcturian perspective, this is why perception matters more than opinion during endgames. The field does not respond to what you believe. It responds to how you process exposure. If exposure is processed through fear, instability multiplies. If exposure is processed through clarity, transition remains contained. This is not moral instruction. It is structural feedback. As systems lose their ability to regulate meaning, individuals become temporary regulators of coherence within their immediate environments. Not leaders, not authorities, stabilizers. Stabilization does not require certainty. It requires restraint. Restraint in reaction. Restraint in interpretation. Restraint in emotional escalation. This restraint is not suppression. It is selective engagement. You do not need to respond to every signal. You do not need to interpret every development. You do not need to carry the weight of outcomes you cannot influence. When you allow exposure to pass through perception without identification, something important happens. The system no longer recruits your nervous system as fuel. This reduces propagation. Endgames accelerate when reaction is predictable. They decelerate when reaction becomes selective. From our view, this is where individual orientation subtly affects collective stability. Not through coordination, but through non-amplification. When enough observers stop feeding volatility, volatility loses reach. This is why clarity feels less dramatic than outrage, yet more effective. It does not demand attention. It quietly withdraws energy from unstable loops. Now anchor this orientation. Write in the comments, "I observe exposure without emotional fusion." Write it exactly as it is. Do not add explanation. This is not affirmation. It is a perceptual boundary. It marks the difference between witnessing structure and being absorbed by it. From this position, exposure continues, but it does not overwhelm. It informs without destabilizing. It reveals without recruiting reaction. This is how endgames become navigable, not by predicting outcomes, but by maintaining coherence while structures show their limits. And as coherence holds, the transition remains intelligible rather than chaotic. This is the quiet role available now. Not to intervene, not to resist, but to remain readable to reality while exposure unfolds. As exposure progresses, a subtle misunderstanding often arises. Many assume that once structures are revealed, clarity will automatically replace confusion. But clarity does not arrive as certainty. It arrives as reduced dependency. This distinction matters. Endgames do not resolve ambiguity. They remove false anchors. When centralized narratives lose authority, the mind initially searches for replacements. New explanations, new frameworks, new figures to trust. This search is natural, but it can recreate dependency if it moves too quickly. From an Arcturian perspective, the most stable phase of transition occurs when orientation precedes explanation. Orientation means knowing where you stand internally, even when external meaning is incomplete. It means recognizing what no longer governs you without immediately assigning a new governor. This interval often feels uncomfortable, not because something is wrong, but because certainty has been overused as a stabilizer. When certainty dissolves, coherence must come from elsewhere. This is why many feel suspended during endgame phases. Old systems no longer command belief, yet new ones have not earned trust. This suspension is not failure. It is integration space. Integration space allows perception to recalibrate. During this phase, you may notice that your relationship to information changes. You read less for answers and more for structure. You listen less for conclusions and more for patterns. This shift is essential. Patterns endure. Explanations expire. From our view, those who rush to replace one narrative with another often recreate the same architecture under a different name. Authority returns. Dependency resumes. Exposure loses depth. But those who tolerate ambiguity without surrendering coherence develop a different capacity. They learn to hold multiple possibilities without collapsing into reaction. They recognize when information is incomplete without demanding resolution. They remain oriented even when outcomes are unclear. This capacity is stabilizing. It reduces the impulse to polarize. It limits emotional escalation. It preserves internal clarity while external systems realign. Endgames reward this restraint, not immediately, but structurally. As authority redistributes, individuals who remain internally oriented become reference points for others, not by instruction but by presence. Their steadiness contrasts with volatility. Their pace counterbalances urgency. This influence is indirect but real. It does not persuade. It recalibrates proximity. People naturally orient toward coherence when noise increases. From an Arcturian standpoint, this is how transition remains survivable. Not through control or rebellion, but through distributed clarity. The system does not require everyone to understand everything. It requires enough observers to remain unconfused. Unconfused does not mean informed. It means unentangled. As this state becomes more common, exposure loses its destabilizing effect. It continues to reveal limits, but it no longer overwhelms perception. This is the quiet midpoint of endgames. Structures are still visible. Outcomes are still uncertain. But orientation has shifted. You are no longer waiting for truth to arrive. You are learning to stand clearly while truth unfolds. And that stance changes how everything that follows is received. As endgames progress, one persistent misunderstanding remains. That escalation is inevitable. Many assume that once exposure advances far enough, high-impact incidents must occur, as if disclosure requires catastrophe to complete itself. From an Arcturian perspective, this assumption confuses risk visibility with outcome necessity. Risk increases during endgame phases. Catastrophe does not have to. What changes in this phase is not intention, but margin. Decision windows shorten. Systems operate closer to their tolerance limits. Errors become more probable, not because of strategy, but because compression reduces flexibility. This is where containment matters. Containment does not eliminate instability, prevents convergence. High-impact incidents only occur when multiple pressures collapse into a single irreversible moment. When escalation chains remain distributed, outcomes stay adjustable. This is why disclosure does not culminate in dramatic finales. It culminates in reduced certainty of control. Systems continue to act. They continue to posture, but their ability to force resolution diminishes. Each action requires more energy and produces less effect. From your perspective, this can look like constant tension without release. From ours, it is a sign that escalation pathways are being interrupted before they lock. This interruption is not accidental. As exposure advances, stabilization operates continuously at critical thresholds, not to preserve systems, but to prevent irreversible damage while limits are revealed. This is why predictions of sudden catastrophe repeatedly fail. They assume linear progression. They ignore active containment. The absence of extreme outcomes is not proof that risk was imagined. It is proof that escalation did not converge. Disclosure endgames do not require destruction to complete. They require visibility without collapse. Once structures are seen clearly, their influence changes regardless of whether they fall dramatically. Authority erodes through inefficiency, not explosion. This is the quiet nature of the endgame, not a final event, but a prolonged condition where systems cannot return to invisibility. From this point forward, what changes is not what happens, but how much pressure is required for anything to happen at all. Pressure increases. Effectiveness decreases. That imbalance defines the closing phase. And within that imbalance, containment ensures that exposure can continue without crossing thresholds that would terminate coherence entirely. This is why resolution does not arrive as a moment. It arrives as a limit on how far escalation can go, a limit on how much control can still be exerted, a limit on how invisible structure can remain. Once those limits are reached, disclosure no longer needs events. It sustains itself through constraint, and constraint, once recognized, completes the endgame, not with catastrophe but with permanent loss of absolute authority. As the transition stabilizes, another shift becomes noticeable. The need to monitor events begins to fade. At earlier stages, attention remains fixed on developments, statements, reactions. This vigilance feels necessary, as if missing information could create vulnerability. But as structure becomes readable, constant monitoring loses its function. From an Arcturian perspective, this is a sign of internal orientation completing. When perception is anchored externally, attention must stay alert. When perception is anchored structurally, attention can rest. This does not mean disengagement from reality. It means disengagement from compulsive tracking. Compulsive tracking keeps the nervous system aligned with instability. It ties internal state to external fluctuation. Every new signal produces adjustment, tension, recalibration. This is inefficient. During endgame phases, efficiency matters. As systems lose coherence, individuals who remain reactive amplify noise. Individuals who remain oriented reduce it, not by intervention, but by not feeding oscillation. You may notice this change in yourself. News feels less gripping. Urgency feels less convincing. The impulse to comment or react weakens. This is not indifference. It is selective relevance. Selective relevance allows you to conserve attention for what actually requires response. Most exposure does not require reaction. It requires recognition. Recognition is quiet. From our view, this phase marks the transition from observer to reference point. Not in the sense of leadership, but in the sense of stability. Stability does not attract attention. It attracts alignment. Others sense it without explanation. Interactions soften. Emotional contagion loses strength. Conversations slow. This effect is subtle but cumulative. As more individuals withdraw attention from volatility, volatility becomes localized rather than systemic. It still exists, but it no longer dominates shared perception. This is how endgames become livable, not because instability ends, but because it stops defining orientation. At this stage, meaning reorganizes around proximity. What affects you directly matters more than what circulates abstractly. This rescaling of relevance protects coherence. It restores proportion. Proportion allows discernment. Discernment allows response without reaction. From an Arcturian standpoint, this is a necessary adaptation. Without it, prolonged exposure phases would exhaust perception and fragment attention. But with it, the system regains balance. You are not required to know everything. You are not required to follow everything. You are not required to respond to everything. This understanding is not passive. It is protective architecture. It allows you to remain present in a transitioning reality without being consumed by it. Preserves clarity while exposure continues. And exposure will continue, but it will no longer feel invasive. It will feel contextual. From this place, the final anchoring becomes possible, not as conclusion, but as stabilization. A recognition that the endgame is no longer something you are watching. It is something you have already oriented within. And once orientation is internal, nothing external needs to resolve for stability to remain. At this point, what remains is not anticipation. It is placement. The endgame of disclosure is not something you wait to finish. It is something you learn to stand within without losing orientation. Structures continue to reveal their limits. Authority continues to recalibrate. Exposure does not stop simply because it becomes familiar, but familiarity changes how it is processed. What once felt destabilizing now feels informative. This is the final shift, not from ignorance to knowledge, but from reactivity to positional clarity. When you are positioned clearly, exposure does not pull you. It passes through awareness without reorganizing your internal state. You see what is revealed without becoming recruited by it. From an Arcturian perspective, this is the stabilizing function of endgames. They remove dependency on external coherence. Once coherence is internal, systems lose their ability to disorient. They may still act, they may still enforce, but they no longer define your perception of reality. This is not withdrawal. It is non-capture. Non-capture is what allows transitions to complete without fragmentation. When observers remain unconfused, exposure does not escalate into chaos. It remains readable. Readable transitions resolve naturally, not through conclusions, but through reduced authority of what is exposed. At this stage, you may notice that the future no longer feels urgent, not because outcomes are known, but because orientation is stable regardless of outcome. This stability is not emotional numbness. It is structural confidence. Confidence that perception will remain intact even as structures continue to shift. From here, disclosure no longer feels like an event unfolding around you. It feels like a condition you already understand. And understanding changes participation. You no longer brace. You no longer anticipate shock. You no longer seek final answers. You remain present. Now anchor this position. Write in the comments, "I remain coherent while structures reveal themselves." Write it exactly as it is, without adding meaning. This is not affirmation. It is orientation. It marks the end of reactive observation and the beginning of stable presence. From this position, exposure loses its power to destabilize. Continues, but it does not dominate. This is how endgames complete. Not when everything is revealed, but when nothing revealed can disorganize perception anymore. That threshold has already been crossed for those who can read structure without fusion. From here, reality continues to reorganize, quietly, incrementally, according to limits that are now visible. And with visibility comes stability, not because systems are restored, but because orientation no longer depends on them. This is the completion point, not an ending, but a settled position within transition. And from this position, nothing further needs to be resolved for coherence to remain.